What's going on, man? Welcome back to the basement. I'm Ron, and today we're going to talk through my top 45 wide receiver rankings for fantasy football. I know a lot of you guys have drafts coming up this weekend, and I want to make sure you have an up-to-date set of rankings for these drafts. Now, we're going to skip all of the intro. The song is not going to play here. We're going to get right into the tier list. As always, if you enjoy, make sure you leave a like, subscribe. This is going to be for full PPR, half PPR. We're going to get through 45 receivers. We're going to go quick. If you want my in-depth analysis on all of these guys, you can find them in previous videos. This is just more for the rankings. Now, you'll also see tiers here, right, where we put CeeDee Lamb here at the wide receiver 1 overall tier. That's because I believe that he is one of the best candidates to hit wide receiver 1 overall, and we'll kind of get into what each tier means as we get there. But I feel much stronger about the tier breaks and kind of where I see the value gaps at the position than I do about, wide receiver 1 versus wide receiver 2. Because once we get to this wide receiver 1 overall tier, him and the next guy are both candidates. And if you also want to see, okay, well, CeeDee Lamb is wide receiver 1. Who's my wide receiver 37? I'll have in the description 1 through 45 numbered, and I'll have the timestamps out by tonight. Now, let's get into this with CeeDee Lamb. It's pretty simple. He was the wide receiver 1 overall last year. He's in the prime of his career. His quarterback is Dak Prescott, and they should score points. He's not holding out anymore. He got paid. CeeDee Lamb should be good to go. And then you could put Tyreek Hill at wide receiver 2. And if you want to put him at wide receiver 1, you absolutely can. This is a guy who was on a 2,000 receiving yard pace last year until he got banged up down the stretch. This Dolphins defense is also bad, right? Where Christian Wilkins heads to the Raiders. You have Jalen Phillips tears his, I believe, Achilles. And you had Bradley Chubb tear like a ACL. Their defense is decimated. And what that could do is cause a lot more shootouts for Tyreek Hill in this offense. Tyreek is your second wide receiver 1 overall candidate. Now, at wide receiver 3, we have a tier breakdown to elite wide receiver 1. This is somebody I would still feel really, really good about taking in the middle of the first round and having as my wide receiver 1. I would just have a small tier break from the top 2. And at wide receiver 3, I don't think you guys are going to love this, but we're going to put Ja'Marr Chase here. Now, I get he's still holding out, and it's a little bit squeamish to have to take him in the first round with all this uncertainty, but these studs get paid. We just saw CeeDee Lamb get paid, and I imagine that Ja'Marr Chase's agent is looking at the deal that CeeDee Lamb just got done and is going to work something out that's either similar to that, or maybe there's just a bonus that he's seeking out because he does still have 2 years left on his deal, but the Bengals have all the leverage in the world. But then you also have the other side of it where Joe Burrow, really good friends with Ja'Marr Chase. They were, of course, teammates at LSU, and I truly do believe that this deal will get done potentially in the next few days. I just think that the situation is too good for Ja'Marr Chase. He has Joe Burrow, his college quarterback there, and we saw them get humming last year after Joe Burrow kind of recovered from his calf injury, and then Joe Burrow, of course, goes down. But with Ja'Marr Chase in this offense, he's played 45 career games so far. He has 18 points per game in those first 45 career games. The only people that have more than 18 points per game in their first 45 career games, OBJ, Justin Jefferson, Randy Moss, Jerry Rice. He is in a rare era of wide receiver, and I still do believe that we still haven't had that true Ja'Marr Chase wide receiver 1 overall best receiver in football type of season, and I do think that is coming, and it could happen here. And I just think it's a really good blend of talent, quarterback, and then also offense, where Mike Clay has them projected for the most dropbacks in the NFL. They're going to pass the ball a ton, and with no Tyler Boyd and kind of the slot wide open, we're going to see Ja'Marr Chase in the slot, moved all around the formation, and that is really fun. Now, at wide receiver 4, we have Amon-Ra St. Brown. Super high floor. He had over 20 points per game last year. He's on a really good Detroit offense. My only concern is how many of their touchdowns will just get punched in by Montgomery and Gibbs. And then also, they did revamp the defense, right? They drafted Terrion Arnold, the kid out of Missouri, Rakestraw, I believe. They signed some guys. Another year of Aiden Hutchinson, of course. So their defense is actually interesting. Their defense led them into a lot of shootouts last year. And of course, I think there's a stat where Jared Goff might not be playing outside of a dome until week 16, so that's all good and well. I do just have some concerns for how much of rushing volume there's going to be. I believe Mike Clay has him projected for the 27th most dropback, so that's the only downside. We're splitting hairs here. Amon-Ra St. Brown's my wide receiver 4, which brings us to Justin Jefferson. This is as low as you could sell me on having the best wide receiver in football. It's Justin Jefferson. He's a monster. He did have 20-plus points per game last year in those games without Kirk Cousins. I think it was a 4-game sample. I will say that I think that they're a little bit inflated, and they're a little bit of bad faith to just point at them and say, well, he was on pace for a monster season even without Kirk Cousins. Well, 2 of them were against the Detroit Lions, which last year the defense sucked. Especially their passing defense was really bad last year. So I don't know. I have a tough time saying that he'll have 20-plus points a game without good quarterback play, but Sam Darnold kind of getting Brock Purdy treatment from Kevin O'Connell, kind of how Shanahan has had his Jimmy Garoppolo's, and even getting usable production from like CJ Beathard. We could see that with Sam Darnold, and that could be interesting. But there is some downside here where Sam Darnold could just really be bad, and then all of a sudden it is a Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, Drake London situation we've had the past few years where it's good player, bad quarterback. But Jefferson's, of course, in another stratosphere of talent from those other guys. So I just have a hard time putting him much lower than this. If you want to put him as high as wide receiver 3, you absolutely can. That's the whole point of these tiers. If you want to jumble them around, you can absolutely go ahead. Then at wide receiver 6, we have A.J. Brown in our next tier. These are still guys I feel really good about as my wide receiver 1, but I'm probably drafting in the late first instead of like the middle of the first round. And here we have A.J. Brown. He has never had more than 18 points per game in a given season, but he's also never been outside the top 10 in yards per out run. This is a really, really good player that's kind of been let down by quarterback play and low-volume passing offenses. But if you wanted to zoom in on last year, if you remember, I mean, it kind of sucks because I had a lot of A.J. Brown, but it put us in a spot where he was a monster to start the year. Heading into his Week 10 bye, he had 22.6 points per game. He ended the year with like just under 18 points per game. So just like after the bye week, the Eagles fell apart. Like Sirianni's seat was warm. They fired the OC. They lose to the Bucs in the first round of the playoffs. Like the whole thing just absolutely melted down. I do think this year, Jalen Hurts had like a weird knee injury too that he like wouldn't tell anybody about. That should be fixed this year. They bring in Kellen Moore. And if A.J. Brown gets any of that schemed up motion guy usage from Kellen Moore, that's a big boost for him. And it wouldn't shock me if like in the year that no one expects A.J. Brown to hit that 20-plus point per game ceiling, that he just goes out there and does it. Because I do think that he's genuinely one of the best wide receivers in the league. It's just been a situation thing for A.J. Brown, which is kind of the story with Garrett Wilson, but not in the same. A.J. Brown, of course, is more low volume than it is quarterback play. Garrett Wilson, the quarterback play has just been brutal. Like, they literally trotted out Tim Boyle last year, who, like, you know, he had more interceptions than touchdowns at UConn in college. Just brutal, brutal quarterback play. Now he gets Aaron Rodgers, a revamped offensive line, and you're going to get an offense with Nathaniel Hackett and Aaron Rodgers that loves to pass the ball in the red zone. Even last year, I think that they had the highest red zone pass rate over expectation among the entire league. And that was with Zach Wilson at quarterback. So when they get in close, they're going to put Garrett Wilson in motion. They're going to run some goal line fade stuff, some weird like rub routes. And Garrett Wilson is a genuine candidate to like lead the league in receiving touchdowns this year, which is really interesting. Then we have Puka Nacua as our wide receiver 8. People love to say, well, Cooper Kupp is here and Puka Nacua might just be a one-year wonder and like a sophomore slump. He had, you just don't, we talked about this on stream, which by the way, we stream every night from now until kickoff and we have a blast in there. But he had 17.6 points per game last year. That was more than Justin Jefferson had as a rookie. And he did that as a 5th round pick, playing 11 games next to Cooper Kupp. The only other rookie receivers to have 17 or more points per game, Odell Beckham, Randy Moss, Jamar Chase, Anquan Bolden, Justin Jefferson, Michael Thomas. There is no fluke, there is no sophomore slump, and he did this with only 6 touchdowns. Imagine he had 10 or 12. It would have been one of the grossest rookie seasons we've ever seen. It already was that, and we already have an 11-game sample of him on the field next to Cooper Kupp, and this is as a 5th-round rookie next to Cooper Kupp. He bests him in air yard share, targets, target share, receiving yards per game, yards per out run. He had 3 touchdowns to Kupp's 5 touchdowns. He had a lower first read percentage, but even still, 15.5 points per game to Cooper Kupp's 14.8. And I think that can even get a little bit higher with Puka Nacua in year 2 in this offense. I do think that this offense is also built in a way where you're going to see, I actually have Cooper Kupp pretty high as well later on here. This offense is built in a way where the third option is Demarcus Robinson or Colby Parkinson. The targets are going to be, like, you're going to see a 25% plus target share like we saw here, right, where you look at target share 25.7% and 25.1%. Those are both wide receiver 1 type target shares. They're both going to get a ton of targets in what Vegas has as a top 12 scoring offense. And you also have Aaron Donald, now retired, and this defense is awful. And we could see a lot of shootouts here, a lot of scoring to the receivers, and that is really fun. Now, moving on to the next tier, and this is going to be a big thing that people are going to look at and say, well, this is only 9 receivers. You only have 9 receivers inside of your wide receiver 1 tiers. Yes, when I'm drafting teams, the tiers are really vibes based. If I go into a draft and one of these high-end wide receiver 2s is my wide receiver 1, I better have some sick running backs because I don't feel great about them in my wide receiver 1 spot. And first up, we'll have Marvin Harrison Jr. Again, these are not like, If I wanted it to just be wide receiver 1 through 12, I would just not even have tiers. I would just have wide receiver 1, 2, 3, 4, and it would just be 1 through 12, 13 through 24, 25 through 36, and that would be that. But this is where I see the tier breaks, and I do truly think that there is a little bit of a pretty massive gap in terms of these like high-end wide receiver 1s from CeeDee through Puka. The rest have big question marks, right? Our wide receiver 9 here with Marvin Harrison Jr. is a rookie receiver. If he had what Puka had last year, one of the best seasons ever, Marvin Harrison Jr. would finish as like the wide receiver 8 or 9 in terms of like 17.6 points per game. So it's not super sexy, but he is one of the best rookie wide receiver prospects I've ever seen in my entire career of doing this. He is an absolute monster. He's attached to Kyler Murray. He should get going right away. His underdog pick'em lines right now, 83.5 receptions, 1,075 receiving yards, 6.5 receiving touchdowns. That's a pretty decent stat line for a rookie, and we could see him even exceed that as well. Then our wide receiver 10. And again, these guys all have question marks. I like Nico Collins a lot, but certainly it is a crowded wide receiver room with Stefon Diggs and Tank Dell. But I'm betting on him as an elite talent at the X wide receiver position where Diggs and Tank Dell will be kind of duking it out for slot flanker work. Nico Collins is the established X receiver. And if we look at this Jacob Gibbs tweet from last month or so, if we look at receivers with over 300 routes, over 3+ yards per out run, Nico Collins is the youngest receiver to ever do it. The only other receivers to do it, Brandon Aiyuk, Julio Jones, Cooper Kupp, Tyreek Hill. Pretty damn good list. He was an absolute monster last year, and he had like 17 points per game as like a top 12 receiver, and you're now getting a cheaper price than where he finished in his first breakout year, which a lot of times we see these guys have that first breakout, right? CeeDee Lamb and Amon-Ra St. in 2022 both hit like 16, 17 points per game, and then they hit 20+. If Nico Collins is going to hit 20+ points per game, it would be this season. I do think CJ Stroud can just light the world on fire with like an MVP campaign and get Nico Collins there. Then we have Drake London. Similar deal to Garrett Wilson. Good wide receiver. I do think Garrett Wilson's probably in another tier of talent than Drake London, but good receiver who goes from awful quarterback play to now good quarterback play, right? This is a team that was 7th worst in points scored, 8th lowest pass attempts. They're now projected by Vegas for the 13th most points, projected by Mike Clay for the 12th most pass attempts. So it should be a much better offense. You have Zach Robinson coming from the Rams scheme, which is going to be much more modern. And then also, of course, your quarterback goes from Desmond Ridder, who I think just got like traded or cut from wherever he was at. And now you get Kirk Cousins and then Michael Penix as well, who at the very least is better than Desmond Ridder. So that's all very exciting. And I didn't even put Drake London up here on the graphic, but you can see him there. Drake London as our wide receiver 11, which then brings us to the rest of our wide receiver 2s here. First up being the wide receiver 12, Chris Olave. Small tier break. And his thing is that he doesn't have the benefit of Drake London and Garrett Wilson where like his quarterback gets upgraded or something. He still has Derek Carr. I do think that there's actually a good chance that Derek Carr gets benched midseason, and then we have Spencer Rattler, which then you're just like, you have a day 3 rookie quarterback who, like, I like Spencer Rattler a lot, but he could also just be Aiden O'Connell, and then that's not fun either. But this is a good receiver. He has never finished under 2 yards per out run. He has never finished under an 80 PFF receiving grade. I haven't looked, but in terms of wide receivers to do that in their first 2 years, it would be a really, really short list. He has wide receiver 19 and 25 point per game finishes, but we have him at wide receiver 12. There is a chance he has a year 3 breakout. We know he's going to get a lot of targets, and they did bring in OC Clint Kubiak, who should at least use more play action, more motion, and is a much better OC than I think it was Carmichael last year, who is just absolutely brutal. Then you have Davante Adams, who's just a similar bet to Olave in that, you know, we're talking wide receiver 13 here. He is probably a good a bet as any of the rest of these receivers to finish in the top 10 in targets or target share. But, you know, his quarterback is Aiden O'Connell or Gardner Minshew with Luke Getsy calling plays. It's not great. He'll probably get a high target share because of Luke Getsy. He did that with DJ Moore last year. Maybe Davante Adams could have a DJ Moore type of year. But he's also now 32 and could definitely decline a bit as he gets older here. Then our wide receiver 14, we have Cooper Kupp. Again, I told you I was going to have him a little bit higher. Even though we're high on Puka Nacua, I'm high on both. Now, I'm not drafting them on the same teams with each other, but I do think that you can't go wrong drafting one or the other on a lot of your teams. This is an offense, again, like I really like this offense. They're going to score points. Their defense is not good. And then also, when we talk about like crowded receiver rooms, I think we get too caught up in like this receiver is going to be the wide receiver one in his offense, right? Like talking about a Diontae Johnson of the world or Calvin Ridley, wide receiver one in a bad offense, or the wide receiver two in a good offense. And I think that this highlights it as well, where I think a lot of people get caught up on the depth chart and you're missing the forest for the trees with that, right? Where Adam Levitan says here, have heard some aren't comfortable spending high draft capital on wide receiver twos. Don't think that tag really matters. Target share last season exclusively on plays both the wide receiver one and wide receiver two ran a route. And you can see Cooper Kupp 27%, Puka Nacua 29%, and the rest of these are pretty split as well. A 27% target share for Cooper Kupp. Those are wide receiver one numbers. We saw it with the graphic before when they were on the field together. 25% target share. So this is a good offense. Cooper Kupp, we haven't gotten any word on him potentially having an injury this offseason, so he could definitely sort of rebound here, but he is definitely an aging receiver. And I did want to bring this up as well from Jacob Rickroad. Little known fact, an average of 4 teams per year will have 2 wide receivers finish top 24 PPR. 12 teams won't even have 1 top 24 PPR wide receiver. So just something to think about when we talk about, this guy's the wide receiver 2 in his offense. Why would I want him when I could get somebody else's wide receiver 1? Well, touchdowns, yards, offensive efficiency, all of that really helps. So I'd rather have the wide receiver 2 in a good offense than the wide receiver 1 in a bad offense. Now, after that, we have the wide receiver 1, presumably in a good offense, in Deebo Samuel as my wide receiver 15 here. He actually outscored Aiyuk on a per-game basis last year. He's a good player in a good offense. You have the Aiyuk uncertainty where maybe he gets traded, maybe he sits out, maybe he comes back and sort of needs a ramp-up period the first few weeks. So Deebo gets a bump there. It's only a 2-game sample, but he does have 24.7 points per game in 2 career games without Brandon Aiyuk. And then also some upside, like this is putting on your tinfoil hat. But with Elijah Mitchell out for the season, I know that they have Jordan Mason, but they could certainly, like if McCaffrey misses a game, Deebo would almost be as much of a handcuff as Jordan Mason, where he would also then get a ton of work in terms of like rushing volume, which is good for Deebo because he is a monster in the rushing game. So he has like a lot of outs to upside. If anybody else gets hurt, he really benefits from that. So wide receiver 15, I'm fine with Deebo there. Then at wide receiver 16, we have Jaylen Waddle, like Kupp, wide receiver 2 in a really good offense. Last year, Jaylen Waddle was actually really good. He just kept getting pulled from games early and screwing us all over in fantasy football. But in terms of yards per out run, targets per out run, first downs per out run, PFF receiving grade, he ranked top 10 in all of those metrics and was really good. And like that Adam Levitan tweet showed, he had a 27% target share while on the field with Tyreek Hill. So that's a wide receiver 1 target share. I will take that all day long in a good, high-scoring Mike McDaniel offense. Again, the defense isn't as good this year. The only downside with Waddle right now, and it's the issue we had with him last year in terms of him getting banged up, he's had some kind of leg injury. Jeff Mueller says here, Jaylen Waddle still limited 4 weeks after his injury, still no specifics known. Then he says at the end of this thread, I think we've narrowed it down to being a left calf strain. He was practicing near full go with a compressive sleeve over his left calf, so my worries are low at this point. McDaniel did say Jaylen Waddle's injury was minor/soft tissue related. Hopefully no reoccurrence week 1 through 4. So it's something to monitor. It seems like it's not a huge deal, but I mean, that's kind of how it starts. So definitely something to think about with Jaylen Waddle. Then at wide receiver 17, we have the rookie Malik Nabers. He tells they like unretired some Flaherty. I don't even know who this guy is. I was born in 01, so I'm not gonna know who that guy is in terms of like retiring the number 1 for the Giants. But this is somebody who had a 30% target share in the preseason. He was used in motion a ton in the preseason. He's going to be the focal point of this offense. And yes, it's not going to be pretty, but they should pass the ball a ton. And Dable got a 16th offensive points scored finish out of this offense in 2022 when Daniel Jones' best target was Darius Slayton. So I do think that Dable can scheme his way into this being a passable offense, and I don't think that he is that much different of a bet from Davante Adams and Olave. Good receivers, bad offenses. So he fits in this tier as well for me. And you'll see this is actually a really flat tier, and it's why it's so tough this year at the back end of the second, and it's honestly why I'm prioritizing those running backs in the second round so much, like Achane, Jonathan Taylor, Jahmyr Gibbs, because Olave and Davante Adams go in the middle of the second, whereas Cooper Kupp on these home league sites and Deebo and Waddle and Nabers are all going like late third, early fourth, and I just don't see a big difference between those guys in the second round and these guys later on. We'll also bring up DJ Moore at wide receiver 18. He had 96 catches, 1,300 receiving yards, 8 touchdowns last year in an offense with Justin Fields and Tyson Bagent. It's a very similar bet to Nico Collins for me. I just think that this is an elite player in a good offense. The Bears right now are projected to have the 16th most points by Vegas. Caleb Williams, I really do think, is as good as advertised. He could just come in and be a really, really good quarterback right away. And DJ Moore could just be his number one target. They bring a new OC, Shane Waldron, who has been top 10 in pass rate and top 10 in neutral pace with the Seahawks. They should score points. They're going to be up-tempo. And I just like DJ Moore being at the front and center of that environment. Then at wide receiver 19, we have DK Metcalf, who has been top 6 in end zone targets each year of his career. And I just want to bet on this Ryan Grubb offense. He comes from Washington. He's going to bring really fun concepts. He had one of the highest passing rates and deep pass rates in college football last year. And DK Metcalf thrives in that area, right? In the passing game, in the deep passing game. And if he can get everything to sync in 1 year, he keeps on having these years where he'll have like a bonkers yards per out run, and then he'll be unlucky in touchdowns, or he'll have a bonkers touchdown year, and then he'll be unlucky in yards per catch. And if he can just get the efficiency to sync up with the touchdowns one of these years, we're going to see a true 20-plus point per game, like monster year season from DK Metcalf. We haven't seen that upside since his second year, but I do think it's hidden down there somewhere. If it was going to happen, it was going to be this year. And then outside of that, he's usually never a bad pick. Like, he's almost always in the wide receiver 2 mix. So at wide receiver 19, I'm very fine taking him. Then we have DeVonta Smith as our wide receiver 20. Very similar to, the other wide receiver 2s in good offenses. It should be a little bit more low volume with Jalen Hurts at quarterback, but Kellen Moore, whoever gets the slot role with Kellen Moore is going to benefit a ton. The early reports is that it's going to be DeVonta Smith. I have a hard time how you see A.J. Brown, a running back playing receiver, and you want to use DeVonta Smith in the slot role, but Kellen Moore is the one calling plays, not me. So if DeVonta Smith has that role on lock, that's going to be absolutely huge for him, and was why Keenan Allen was such a monster down the stretch last year. And this is somebody who's finished top 24 in points per game each of the last 2 seasons. Super high floor, and if he does get this slot role, he could definitely get, a back-end wide receiver 1 finish. Then we have Brandon Aiyuk at wide receiver 21, and we're still going in this wide receiver 2 tier, by the way. But Brandon Aiyuk is tough. He does join that list that Nico Collins is on, right, where 300-plus routes, 3-plus yards per out run, rare air of Julio Jones, Cooper Kupp, Tyreek Hill, but we now have him holding out, and it's tough to hit 3-plus yards per out run. Of course it's tough. You can see the list and how rare it is, and he did that and only finishes the wide receiver 15, right? Nico Collins was at least like wide receiver 7 last year because of the volume, but because the 49ers are such a low-volume passing offense that even an otherworldly efficiency season still didn't give him a top 12 finish. So we now have a spot here where he's holding out and might be you need to be on everything. You have to be on your P's and Q's here to hit 3-plus yards per out run and thread the needle to get to wide receiver 15. Brandon Aiyuk, now that he's sitting out, not building that rapport with Brock Purdy, it's going to be a little bit tougher to just pick up. You don't just simply pick up where you left off on a 3-plus yards per out run season, unless if you are, Tyreek Hill in his prime. We'll see if Brandon Aiyuk can do it. I think it's less likely to happen now that he's sitting out. And then on top of that, you now have trade concerns. If he goes to the Steelers, he gets bumped down to the next tier here. So there's a lot hanging in the balance, but he is a good player and a good offense, so I don't want to bury him too far. And I actually drafted him last night on stream with Jacob and Liam. People love when we stream together and draft those teams. Then we have Mike Evans here. I think you guys are going to hate this ranking of Mike Evans at wide receiver 22. But this is not going to be an amazing passing offense. No Dave Canales this year. Baker could completely crater back to what he was with the Carolina Panthers, and that could be really scary. And Mike Evans had 79 catches, 1,200 yards, and 13 touchdowns last year. He's now 32, 31. I'm not going to bet against Mike Evans. I think that he can still hit his 1,000-yard receiving season like he always does. But maybe he goes from 79 and 1,200 and 13 touchdowns to 70 catches for 1,000 yards and 7 touchdowns. And then all of a sudden that's like a fringe wide receiver 2. He'll give you some spike weeks, and that's kind of it. People kind of forget that he was a 6th or 7th round pick last year. He's now vaulted all the way back up to the late second. I have not taken him yet in a managed league. Then our last player in this tier, wide receiver 23, is Stefon Diggs. Of course, crowded receiver room, but I just want pieces of this offense. The Texans were 12th in pass attempts last year, 13th in completions, 7th in yards, 14th in passing touchdowns. They should be top 5 across the board this season. So there's going to be a lot more volume and a lot more touchdowns to go around, as much as now it's a crowded room. Stefon Diggs last year had 107 catches, 1,200 yards, 8 touchdowns, 29% target share. I have a hard time saying that he's fallen off. I think he's going to still command a ton of targets. He's still going to be that kind of like smooth operator out of the slot and from flanker. And I think that that'll be interesting. And I do think that there is something to Stefon Diggs wearing out his welcome on these new teams, but not in year one, right? We saw first year on the Bills, he absolutely crushed. I think that could happen again for Stefon Diggs, kind of the honeymoon phase, if you will. Then at wide receiver 24, we have Rashee Rice in the wide receiver 2-3 tier. These are guys that I'm drafting and preferably would put them in my wide receiver 3 or my flex spot. Rashee Rice, year 2 breakout candidate connected to Patrick Mahomes. That's a guy I want to bet on. And there's a lot of parallels to him and Amon-Ra St. Brown when Amon-Ra St. Brown was a rookie, right? Big-time slot guys, low ADOT, which is a little bit concerning, but 2+ yards per out run, 25% targets per out run, 85 PFF receiving grade, and was the 18.5 point per game receiver from weeks 12 on, which was massive. Now, people are going to say, well, he was the only option in this offense. People said the same thing about Amon-Ra St. Brown. People said the same thing about rookie year Brandon Aiyuk when Deebo and Kittle went down, and he was the only option there. You do not simply command targets and hit 18.5 plus points per game. He also was a focal point for the Super Bowl run. I just think it's nonsense to say, well, he was the only guy there. Well, Quentin Johnson was the only guy there in Los Angeles last year when Mike Williams and Keenan Allen went down, and he did absolutely nothing. So it's just not as simple as being the only receiver there. You earn production. You don't just mess around to get 18.5 points per game for a very sizable stretch. Then we have Tee Higgins here, which is kind of the same bet. If I'm being honest, these rankings definitely have ADP in mind, right? These are all coming off of my own rankings, which of course you can find over on Patreon, patreon.com/Ron Stewart. My top 200 ranked by tiers, my avoids, my fades are all outlined there, and then also my target rounds for each player. So okay, this is a guy that Ron is targeting in this given round. And because we have an environment right now where Tee Higgins is a 5th rounder, and DeVonta Smith and Waddle are 4th rounders, I don't see the need to put Tee Higgins here or like next to them. I'm putting him here. I'm drafting him on a lot of my teams. But if I was ranking things without market in mind whatsoever, Tee Higgins would be probably like right here. If I was being completely honest, somewhere in this area, maybe even in this tier. But right here is fine for me. This is a guy who, again, wide receiver 2 in a good offense, has had a top 12 finish next to Jamar Chase before. And he is now establishing a connection with Joe Burrow as Jamar Chase continues to hold out. So Tee Higgins to me is one of the best picks you can make in the 5th round, along with Tank Dell at wide receiver 26 here. He had a crazy good season last year. He finishes a top 24 wide receiver in points per game despite not even having a full-time role. And he is a year 2 breakout candidate in this Texans offense, connected to CJ Stroud. And I want to bet on him as well. Now, I'm not drafting all 3 Texans receivers on the same team, but I think that you can't go wrong if you take one Texans receiver in every draft. I think that's probably a good strategy to go by. After that, we have Zay Flowers here, wide receiver 27. I'm not drafting a ton of them because I just don't think they're going to have a lot of passing yards and touchdowns on this offense. You have Lamar Jackson at quarterback, of course. Derrick Henry signals to us that they want to run the ball. But I have a tough time fading a year 2 breakout candidate. Zay Flowers also showed last year he can command a lot of targets with a 24% target share. That is no joke. He did have an 8.4 yard ADOT. Now, of course, Rashee Rice has the same ADOT issue, but when you're attached to Mahomes in a high volume, like big time passing offense, I don't care as much. But when you're talking about Zay Flowers and it's a low volume passing offense, that low ADOT is going to hurt your efficiency, which is a big deal. So Zay Flowers I have here, there is a chance that he breaks out in a big way in year 2. He expands his role. He actually passes Mark Andrews in terms of the top target here. But I am not holding my breath on it. Then at wide receiver 28, we have Amari Cooper. He set a career high last year with 1,250 receiving yards despite missing 2 games. He had 4 different quarterbacks throw for over 100 passing attempts in this offense. He finishes the wide receiver 17 in points per game. He's my wide receiver 28, so that feels low. And then he was even at 19.9 points per game as the wide receiver 6 last year in a stretch where he didn't have, Dorian Thompson-Robinson as his quarterback, or I think Tyler Huntley either. He was really good with Joe Flacco last year. The issue is that in 12 career games with Deshaun Watson so far, just 13.5 points per game, which is like high-end wide receiver 3 stuff. So it's tough to say. I mean, Deshaun thus far in Cleveland has been brutal. He's already dealing with like arm soreness, but I will say the good news for Amari Cooper is Jameis Winston would actually be a positive for him. I would probably move him up a couple of spots if Jameis Winston was the starting quarterback, just because he embraces chaos so much, and he'll throw a pick and then he'll throw 3 touchdowns and 300 yards and just create a ton of fantasy points for us. So Amari Cooper, that's kind of the positive side, is that if Deshaun goes down again, or if he if they do something weird with his contract or he has to sit out, Jameis is a really good backup quarterback just in terms of fantasy. Then we have our wide receiver 29, George Pickens here. We talked about him on my breakout show. Really fun year 3 breakout candidate. Has more PPR points in the same draft class than Drake London. Had the highest yards per out run in that draft class last year. So he had a higher yards per out run last year than Drake London, Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave. Was really good despite having Kenny Pickett at quarterback, Mason Rudolph at quarterback, Matt Canada calling plays. It should be a little bit better this year. He is the clear number 1 wide receiver option on this team. Arthur Smith at OC isn't all that great, but we do have Russ at quarterback. That should be a big upgrade over Pickett. And if Pickens can just be the number 1 wide receiver here and just kind of win on his own efficiency, like I said, he is the best bet this year to be this year's DJ Moore. Then at wide receiver 30, we have Terry McLaurin. He has been just very steady, just like a nice single. He's finished between 12.3 and 14.9 points per game in each of his 5 or so career years at this point. That is somewhere between fringe wide receiver 2 to wide receiver 3, which is just fine to put in your flex spot. He's a verifiably good wide receiver. He just had bad quarterbacks his entire career. He has Jaden Daniels, who has the upside as a rookie to be a good quarterback, but there is some downside here that he scrambles a ton, he takes a ton of sacks, and that kind of lowers the volume more than you'd like. But Cliff Kingsbury should play up pace, up tempo, and there's a chance, right? He's a rookie quarterback with Jaden Daniels. We don't know what Jaden Daniels is going to look like in the NFL. He could be Robert Griffin III, and then all of a sudden you're cooking with gas in terms of Terry McLaurin having the best quarterback he's ever had. Then we have our last wide receiver in this tier, Michael Pittman Jr. At wide receiver 31. This is really low compared to where he goes on other sites. I just can't get there. He won't have 109 receptions again with a quarterback like Anthony Richardson, who's going to scramble. Last year, he had just 13 points per game in his games with Anthony Richardson to 16.7 points per game in his games with Gardner Minshew. And I think that's something that people really sleep on is, one, he has a career 8.3 yard ADOT, which is right on par with Jarvis Landry. So we're talking super low ADOT. Anthony Richardson would rather just run than dump it off like that. And then also, he doesn't have the touchdown upside to offset the reception scam that he kind of has been, where he just had 109 receptions on an 8-yard ADOT. So we're talking again Jarvis Landry type usage with just 4 or 5 touchdowns last year. But when we talk about Shane Steichen, he likes to run the ball in the red zone. Steichen, this is a good tweet from Jacob Gibbs. Even including the Herbert rookie season, Steichen has a 41% red zone pass rate. Only 4 teams posted a rate that low in 2023. So in close, it's going to be Richardson, it's going to be Jonathan Taylor, and then it'll be Pittman, which is still going to be more 4 to 5 touchdowns than double digits. So I just don't see how he pays off. So wide receiver 31 is where I have Pittman buried in my rankings, so that you're not really taking him that much. Then we have a tier break to Xavier Worthy at wide receiver 32. These are my wide receiver 3s, where if I'm drafting them, I don't really want Worthy in my wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2 spots. I'd like him in the flex, or maybe even as a stash on the bench for early season. But you're going to see a lot of rookie wide receivers from this point on this list. And it all comes down to this. Shout out to Michael Dubner and Jack Miller 02 over on Twitter. And the whole idea with this chart is that as rookies go on and the season progresses, they increase their points per game, whereas we see veterans fall off. And we actually saw this last year where Adam Thielen started out the season really strong, and then he fizzled out. Whereas on the other side, you had Rashee Rice, who was unstartable through 10 weeks and then was a league winner down the stretch. So we want to be targeting, once we get to our bench and our flex spots, we want to be targeting these rookie wide receivers. And Xavier Worthy, to me, is a priority target, wide receiver 32. Last year, just in particular, you had Puka, Jayden Reed, Zay Flowers, and Rashee Rice all finished as top 24 wide receivers in points per game from weeks, I believe it was 10 on. So I think Worthy can be that in this Chiefs offense, connected to Patrick Mahomes, fastest wide receiver of all time in terms of the NFL Combine. And this is not a John Ross. John Ross tore his ACL in his junior season. He also never produced until his final year. Xavier Worthy had 60 for 912 touchdowns in his freshman year at Texas next to legit NFL talent. He could come out here and just be that guy right away. Our next receiver at wide receiver 33 is going to be Jayden Reed. Now, the good, news with Jayden Reed is he was the wide receiver 26 in points per game in a part-time role as a rookie attached to Jordan Love and should progress in year 2. The bad part is that he was just a part-time player last year running 70% of the routes. But like I said, that should progress. That shouldn't be a huge issue this year. He should be the wide receiver 1. He should get some Deebo usage and some carries. And I just want receivers attached to Jordan Love. Wide receiver 33 is about where I'm comfortable taking Reed. Then we have another rookie receiver. This is where I'll have Rome Odunze at wide receiver 34. He was a top 10 NFL draft pick compared to Davante Adams by Matt Harmon, compared to Marvin Harrison Jr. and Jamar Chase by Matt Harmon as one of the best wide receiver prospects he's ever seen. Really, really good player, elite separator, and now he's attached to Caleb Williams, who Caleb Williams then handpicked and was like throwing with before the NFL draft even happened. So he's just somebody I want on a lot of my teams. I do believe that Keenan Allen will have the role in 2 wide receiver sets over Rome Odunze. The hope is here that Rome Odunze is undeniable. Keenan Allen takes a step back as a 32-year-old veteran, and we see that, ships passing in the night by midseason, and Rome Odunze is out there in 2 wide receiver sets and is the wide receiver 2 next to DJ Moore and is usable in fantasy. Then you have wide receiver 35, Chris Godwin. He was the wide receiver 34 in points per game last year, so wide receiver 3 sounds about right. He didn't have his usual slot-heavy role last year. This year they're talking a lot about getting him back into the slot, which is huge, and we could see, Chris Godwin be the one this year that eats, right? Where him and Mike Evans have gone back and forth in years past, and now that Mike Evans is a second-round pick, Chris Godwin's like a 6th-round pick, and he could be the one that's a huge value this year. So we'll see how that pans out. Then we have wide receiver 36, Diontae, and this is where we start to just draft this is where I'm comfortable drafting your wide receiver 1s in bad offenses. Diontae Johnson here. He leads all receivers since he was drafted in open score. It's an ESPN analytics metric, and you also now have Dave Canales in Carolina, potentially upgrading this offense. So if this offense is going to bounce back and be like this year's Buccaneers, where players bounce back, everybody kind of eats, Diontae could be a beneficiary of that. Then at wide receiver 37, you have Calvin Ridley, who is on the Titans this year. He is another, target hog in a bad offense. You have Will Levis. We don't know what he's going to look like, but it will be high volume. Especially with Brian Callahan coming in from the Bengals, who's been up-tempo and pass-heavy during his time there. We're going to see that in Tennessee now. Calvin Ridley, I am open to the idea that he was misused last year in an X role on the line in press coverage, which is what they wanted to use Zay Jones for, but he got banged up. So then they used Calvin Ridley there, and he was kind of like a sacrificial X in that scheme. We could see Ridley come to Tennessee, be used as the, slot flanker type off the line, and that could really help him out. Then at wide receiver 38, probably one of my favorite year 2 breakout candidates here is Jackson Smith-Njigba. He was used in a gadget role, really bad, under 7-yard ADOT slot role with Shane Waldron last year, which is what I'm fearful of that Keenan Allen will be put into this year. And I would just rather bet on JSN heading into year 2. He doesn't have that coach anymore. They're going to use him differently. And like I said, I want pieces of this Ryan Grubb passing offense. And if JSN can leapfrog Tyler Lockett on this depth chart, which, when you draft JSN, it's a bet on his talent, who, this is a guy who went toe-to-toe with Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, 2 guys that are way up here in terms of our rankings at Ohio State. If he could make a step forward and be the guy that we thought the Seahawks drafted, then he'll smash his wide receiver 38 price tag. Then at wide receiver 39, we have Brian Thomas Jr., rookie for the Jaguars, 6'3", 200-plus pounds, 4.3 speed. And just he is already out there in 2 wide receiver sets as a starting receiver for the Jaguars. He's already out there with Gabe Davis, and we have a perfect marriage between him and Trevor Lawrence, where this is a guy who scored 17 touchdowns last year. He was also the highest graded receiver on passes of 20 or more air yards last year, just going absolutely crazy downfield. Trevor Lawrence was one of 5 quarterbacks with 70 or more passes of 20-plus air yards. So he is going to throw the ball deep. That's where Brian Thomas Jr. operates, and it could be a match made in heaven. And then we have Christian Kirk at wide receiver 40. This is going to be low for some of you guys, but he's not a full-time receiver, right? You have Gabe Davis and Brian Thomas Jr. out there in 2 wide receiver sets. You have him and Evan Ingram competing for those intermediate and kind of inside type of routes. So I just don't know how he absolutely crushes this year. He could prove me wrong and finish as wide receiver 30, and I have him at wide receiver 40 here, but this is somebody who has only cracked the top 30 wide receivers in points per game once in his career. and it was in 2022. So I'm just kind of betting against that. I think Brian Thomas Jr. is going to eventually surpass him in terms of production by the end of the year. And similar story with Keenan Allen. Now, I do get comments all the time, man, of like, dude, your rankings are too chalk. But then, like, somehow I ranked Derrick Henry low last video. You guys went crazy about that. So it's such a tough balancing act where I get comments of like, you didn't make any stands. These rankings are cookie cutter. I could have just gone to ESPN to see these. And then I also get, well, this player is too low, and here's why. I'm making a stand here. Christian Kirk, wide receiver 40. Keenan Allen, wide receiver 41. This is a 32-year-old wide receiver changing teams. He's missed 11 games in the last 2 years. He could start strong, but I think that he is going to be the guy who's on that rookie wide receiver chart where while Rome Odunze is getting better, we see Keenan Allen on the blue line getting worse and not being a startable receiver in the fantasy playoffs. Of course, is there some merit to having a Keenan Allen that can, give you startable weeks and good production out the gate in a season? Sure, but he is more expensive than a lot of these guys like, Diontae Johnson and Calvin Ridley and even year 2 breakout JSN. And I'm just not paying a premium for early season production out of a guy in Keenan Allen. And again, he is also very much at risk to have that low ADOT JSN role out of the slot. Then we also have Christian Watson as our wide receiver 42 here. Boom bust player, always dealing with hamstring injuries, but he has a ton of crazy upside where he has a bunch of 20-plus point per game outputs, I guess you could call them. And he is also in a really good offense, attached to Jordan Love, year 3 breakout candidate. But, of course, he could be the odd man out behind Romeo Doubs, Jayden Reed, even Dontavion Wicks. He could pull a hamstring for like the 18th time in his career. There's a lot of downside, but there's also a lot of upside in year 3 breakout candidate Christian Watson. Then our wide receiver 4s here. These are just stash plays that I'm not really playing early on in the season, but Keon Coleman, rookie wide receiver, could potentially be the wide receiver 1 in an offense attached to Josh Allen. Same thing with Ladd McConkey at wide receiver 44. Rookie wide receiver, potentially the wide receiver 1 attached to Justin Herbert. And then you have Jordan Addison, wide receiver 45, who had the weird speeding incident. It plummeted him down boards. It seems like so far he's not going to get suspended. But the J.J. McCarthy injury definitely hurt him in terms of his upside. He's the wide receiver 2 next to Justin Jefferson. It's not a super high upside role, but wide receiver 45 is about where I'm comfortable putting him. Now, that is going to do it for us today. I will have, again, the top 45 all ranked and spelled out for you guys in the description and the comment section down below once I get timestamps put out for this video sometime tonight. And if you want the entire rankings, I have I think I have like 70 receivers ranked on the Patreon, patreon.com/Ron Stewart. You can find that in the description. You can find that in the comment section down below, pinned at the top. My top 200 cheat sheet. It's what I bring into all of my drafts with me, whether it's a home league, whether it's a high stakes draft. It is a tier list, checklist, cheat sheet that is, it has these players ranked by tiers. My targets and my fades are all outlined. The target rounds I'm drafting each of these players is also outlined there. So I think if you have a draft coming up, you should definitely check it out. But if not, I appreciate you guys watching. If you enjoyed, leave a like, subscribe, and I will see y'all in the next one.
Stones, like this froze, ice cold, ice around my body like